We are not government property. Just remember that.
Taxation really failed. I know you might be having that question in your mind, and you hear a lot of people talking about that phrase, more especially the libertarians around the world, in the United States, be it Africa, most especially the libertarians. Now, today we host a very distinguished guest from the United States, and he is called Daniel Behrman. Is a former presidential aspirant in the United States Libertarian Party in 2020. Daniel Behrman is as well aspiring for governor, Texas, 2022, and he is a libertarian activist. Now, Daniel Behrman is an international speaker, defender of free markets and individual liberty. Daniel, as well, is the founder of Taxation, his theft shop, and a podcast. He is, as well, a software engineer. As we welcome him on African Justice Media. African Justice Media is a media platform that is based on the principles of justice, human rights, freedom. We want to make sure that Africa can be developed, and we see that Africa is actually prospering through using these ideas, which many media platforms have not actually talked about. Ours is so different from the media platform, but it is a platform to give people with ideas of freedom, ideas of human rights, ideas, economic ideas that can take Africa and the world to the next level. Now, join me to welcome Daniel Behrman. Welcome to the liberteach Africa series.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. It's great to be.
Why do you think taxation? Because this is what you have been using in all your campaigns when you are standing for president in the Libertarian Party. You've had a campaign about taxation is there. I want to see your analysis, your view about this. Could you try to expound more? What does that mean to a layman who doesn't understand this phrase? Because really it sounds, so maybe alienate when you say taxation is theft. Of course, someone will ask you, please tell us, why is it theft?
Sure. So if we look at the basic defining this up, because we already live in a system where we've already surrendered that right. So I know there's a lot of question, who's going to build the roads, who's going to take care of the sick if you have government run hospitals. There's all kinds of questions of things that are already in play. And it's unfortunate that those things were created before most of us were born. These systems were already in place. We were born and there was already a government, of some form. There was already a government that was already taxing people and already putting different programs into place. So we kind of grew up into that system in the belief that like, hey, this is just the way things are. But when you have that belief and you never question it, you never look at it objectively and say, hey, this is the way that things are, but is it wrong? Are we being robbed? Is there a question of theft here? Is there a question of morality? We have to stop and ask those important questions. And if there is, sure, ending it might change things, but will they change things for the better? Or is there a different way?
Just to hold you a bit. Now, your point is actually focusing on the moral bit of taxation and the way they collect it. You're talking about the voluntary cooperation, whereby an individual is free to accept to be taxed. But now, when we take it to the instinct, to the real basics of theft itself, when you're a thief, you can. But when we look at the way taxation is done, they do tax you, and as well, they give you the services. Now, wouldn't we be right to call it a socially, maybe a socially beneficial kind of theft?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a different example of someone doing something who's not part of the government. Let's say somebody breaks into your house in the middle of the night and they take something. They take your money, they take, whatever. You find out who it is. You approach them, you confront them, and you say, hey, I know you stole from me. And you say, I want it back. And they say, well, the thing that I stole, I already sold it, and I already spent the money, so I don't have anything, I can't give it back to you. And he says, but you know what? Instead, I'm going to paint your house. And now, because he has done something to compensate you for the fact that he stole from you, it doesn't change the fact that he stole from you. And yes, your house might be nicer, but did you want to paint your house? Did you want this done in the first place? Or would you rather have had your thing back that was stolen? So yeah, and every single person is different. And this is, this kind of gets into the trickery of government itself, where government usually, especially when government's trying to act good, what they're trying to do is they usually come up with one program that's supposed to be one size fits all, and it's supposed to be for everybody. But the reality is everybody has different wants and needs. So one person might actually want their house painted and another person might not. One person might get their house painted and say, hey, you know what? If I had to pay a professional painter, that actually might have cost more. So this is a good deal for me. And he'd actually be happy that the whole thing happened. That might be one person. But for another person, they might say, you know what? This is a bad deal. I really wish I could have had that thing back. So this is something that government doesn't do. Government does not take into account every single individual. And so when it takes from us, it's, that's not in consideration, and it's not an agreement. It's not consensual.
The point that comes out actually is that when you're a citizen, you have rights and you do have responsibilities. Now, the moment you accept to be a citizen and accept the rights, the human rights to be respected, as well, you have to respect the responsibilities. Now, if we sign, first of all, we sign the social contract with the government, and that social contract comes with the rights and responsibilities. Because now, if you want to enjoy the rights, as well, you need to enjoy the responsibilities of the land. And if we're talking about money, money belongs to who? Because government prints. If someone says that give what belongs to government, because money brings to them and they do print, what could be your response to that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great points in there. So I want to first address the social contract one. So this is a popular one. A social contract doesn't exist, but a lot of people use it to say, well, we have a social contract, and so you're supposed to do this. But if you ask any person, well, what are the terms of this social contract? Can I see the social contract? Can I see what I actually signed? This contract doesn't exist. And in actual law, if you ever get into an actual court and you're discussing like the terms of a contract and what's enforceable, if people don't agree on what the terms of the contract are, so let's say, for example, if you have a piece of paper, you have to agree on what the contract is because it's written there in black and white. But if you just had a handshake contract, right, it's not written on paper. And if the two parties can't agree what this contract is, you can't enforce the contract. And that's what this social contract is. The social contract is really, it's really just something that somebody came up with and said, oh yeah, let's just say that we have a contract, even though there's actually no contract. A contract has to be very specific, and all parties have to agree consensually.
Thank you. Now, the issue of property and being owned by government, and as well the same issue of social contract. When we relate it to the issue of human rights and international legal documents, for example, the United Nations Human Rights Declaration of 1948, you realize that some of us were not there to sign the human rights international documents. But today, we claim that the international documents give us the full rights. And the same way maybe the social contract would be. Our parents signed for us that this is good for humanity. After realizing that someone should own life, a right to life, someone should have the freedom, they realized that this is good and could be maybe good for the coming generations. Just as we are doing legislations currently that would help the future generations. So when you say that social contract was not signed by us, I relate this to the fact that after the independence of the United States, George Washington, they actually, with friends, those who fought maybe for freedom, for the independence of the United States, they decided to put into writing, which is that the United States Constitution. As well in Uganda here, if we are to date, we have the Constitution that maybe guides the law of the land, that guides how things are going to be moving, how policies, how things are going to be done, like policies, which are organized in a format of a constitution. Wouldn't that be the kind of social contract.
Another good point, because you said, well, so let's say you want to accept being a citizen and you want to accept the benefits of that. Well, most people who are born into most countries, if you leave from one country and go to another one, then yes, you're asking a government, hey, I want to be a citizen. They make you swear an oath and all this other stuff. But if you're just born in a country and they say, oh, you're a citizen of this country because you were born here, you didn't have any choice in that. And so you could be born in one country or a different country, and because of that, your government would tell you you have different rights, but we're all human. We all have the same rights. We're all created equal. They would tell you that, we have different programs in this country than we have in other countries. And because you were born in this country, in this inside of this imaginary line that we drew, you have a responsibility, or not even a responsibility, an obligation to pay for these programs. And I want to, I really like to get specific when I use these two words, responsibility and obligation, because I hear a lot of people use them interchangeably, and they're not. A responsibility is an ability to respond. You can say, as an adult, I am responsible to take care of my community. That means I am able to respond to a situation that might happen in my community. That doesn't mean you have an obligation. That doesn't mean you should be punished if you fail to respond. It simply means you have that ability, and you should, if you're a good person, you should exercise that ability to the best of your ability. But that doesn't mean you have an obligation. It doesn't mean, you can't set priorities. It doesn't mean you have to spend, 24 hours of every day working to make everybody around you better at the expense of yourself. It just means it's an ability to do so, and you can exercise that ability as much as you want. And finally, you brought up the point of money. This is a really interesting question, and you actually brought up it sounded very close to a Bible quote that a lot of people say, where Jesus was asked about taxes. What do we do with this money? He's asking, Caesar is asking for taxes, and he says, give unto Caesar what is his. And he's basically saying the money is his because he created the money. It's got his face on the money. And what's interesting about that is any country you go to, yeah, it has the face of the leaders or past leaders on the money. But the problem is, in most countries and even internationally, there are laws telling you that you have to use this money. In the United States, you have to use United States dollars. You can make certain agreements on other money, but at the end of the day, if we make an agreement that says I'm going to pay you in gold or silver, the government's going to come along and say, no, you have to accept this worthless paper. And so because of that, people deal in this paper money that government created, not because they see that money as better than anything else, but because the government has basically come to everybody and said, you have to use this. So it would be great if we could say, you know what, I don't like this money, because government created money is the worst money out there. We've got, especially now with cryptocurrencies, we've got Bitcoin, gold and silver were always really great before government money came around. There are great currencies out there that we can all use, and they all have different pros and cons. But government basically has forced us to use this. And we've even seen the United States go to war. And I don't know how many other countries have done this as well, but the United States specifically has gone to war with countries who have said, our currency is backed by the US dollar. We don't want to use this anymore. We want to get rid of our US dollars, and we want a currency that's backed by gold. And you've had leaders assassinated. You've had countries overturned simply because they didn't want to use the United States' government money. So it's really, it's easy to say like, oh, well, it's just money. Let's get rid of this money and let me use something else. Why don't we all just do that? And at this point, people look at that and say, well, that's silly because everybody's just used to using money. Why would anybody change? But the reality is we got into this situation at the point of a gun. The government was always pointing a gun at us, telling us we have to use this money. And if they weren't pointing at us directly, they were pointing it at the banks. They were pointing it at the larger businesses, the imports and exports and everything else. And they've forced us to use their money. So it's, that's not something you can exactly say it's theft, but it's theft of freedom or theft of opportunity. Debates that go for hours about the origin of property rights. But this is probably the simplest way I can put this. If depending on where you are, things work a little bit differently. But in general, if you buy property from somebody, you have a receipt, you have a deed. This property is now yours and it belongs to you. Now, if you're forced to pay a government in order to keep that, then you don't really own it. You're just renting it. You bought the rights from somebody, and the deed is just the rights to use that, but you're still renting it from somebody else. Who are you renting it from? You're renting it from the government who's charging this property tax. But the question is, if the government is actually the owner of this land, where's their deed? Who did they buy it from? Where's their receipt? They don't have any of that, because the reality is they just stole it. They basically came and said, you know, here's a map. I'm going to draw a big circle on this land. If there's any people living there, I might kill them in order to claim this land as my own. I might just threaten them and force them to leave. Or maybe there's no people there at all, and I've never even set foot on that land, but I'm going to claim it as mine. And if anybody does enter the land, then, you know, I'll do whatever I want. I'll threaten them. I'll extort them. I'll tell them you can use that land, but you have to pay me money. But they have no actual proper right to that land. Other than the fact that they have, you know, they probably have an army working for them, and that army is basically their claim to say, that's my land, then if you don't like it, we'll kill you. So it's another immoral situation that we've gotten into.
No taxes, but we use the services that are done by those who tax us, like the lords. We use these public services to earn the profit in the economy, to do enterprise, to do business. How would we be able to do business without these social services? Because taxes are used to do that. Thank you.
Sure. So let's see. Let me start with the part about using public services and doing business. So there's this idea that, you know, especially when you look at the United States government is what's called a republic. And this comes from a Greek or a Latin word, which literally translated means a public thing. So what happened was these guys got together and they said, we're going to create this thing, and it's going to be a public thing. Now, that thing is, you know, it's just the same as if you and I got together and said, hey, we're going to start an organization. It's just the two of us. Now, that thing that they created was going to provide some sort of limited public service. And those limited public services were available to the public. So anybody could come and use it. That doesn't mean it's going to be free for everyone. And it doesn't mean that they have the right, just as you and I getting together, starting an organization, we wouldn't have the right to run around and rob everybody, right? The republic that was created didn't have the right to run around and rob everybody either. And in fact, if you look in the United States Constitution, they were very careful when they wrote this. There's two types of taxes in the United States Constitution, and those taxes are actually not even, and I know people say, but then it's not theft. Those taxes are written in a way that it's not just taking from anybody, it's taking from the people who explicitly signed a contract with the United States government. So for example, you could have a government that creates a court, and you can have a court that says, we're going to act as a public service, but you have to pay to use it. And I don't know how it works in every other country, but a lot of them will charge court fees. So if I wanted to sue somebody, I would be able to use their court to do that, but I would have to pay fees. And I'm paying for the judge to be there for his time. I'm paying for the jury. I'm paying for the clerk. I'm paying for all these people by using the court system. So it's not just used by taxes. Then, of course, you have things like roads, which governments kind of really got popular for using roads. And then, of course, they also have military. These are probably two of the biggest ones, two of the biggest expenses that governments do. Except, you know, some other countries, they pay for the hospitals and all these other things. The reality is, in all of these situations, usually what they do is they take a bunch of money from everybody, they overspend it. You have corruption, you have people pocketing the money for themselves. And so this gets into one of those things where we can look at these things and say, look, we as people, we want hospitals, we want roads, we want courts, we want we want some way to defend ourselves, whether it's a military or a police force, or just like us knowing when to get together to defend our community from an invading force. Whatever the case may be, we want these things. But for the government to come and steal from us and force us to pay for the worst possible service that we could get takes away our right to be able to say, hey, you know what? There's 2 companies out here who want to build a road. I'm going to contribute my money to that person in some way, and I'll make a contract specifically with them. Or this other company wants to build a road, and I think they're better, so I'll give my money to them. This is our freedom of choice, and this is our right to do business with whoever we want. We'll still have our roads. We'll still be able to conduct business. And in fact, what you often see is when people want to do that, when government says, yeah, we know there's a road over there that's falling apart, but we're not going to fix it because we're busy spending our money invading some other country. They will actually, while they say they don't have the time or the resources to build that road or that bridge, they will literally prevent people from doing it themselves. So when people say, hey, you know what, the government's not going to do this, we're going to take our responsibility and we're going to fix this bridge so that we can get food into our community, or we can get, whatever we build out to the rest of the world. If they go and do that, the government might come back to them and say, hey, we didn't allow you to do that. And then they'll be in trouble with the government. So again, it's the government claims, to be the only person to be able to provide these services because that's the world that we've lived in for so long. But the reality is that's not how things are naturally. And the government has spent a lot of effort to create that situation so that they basically become the monopoly provider for these resources. That's very important to understand, because getting rid of the government or restricting the government, getting rid of taxes so the government has less power and less resources does not mean getting rid of roads. It does not mean getting rid of protective services or hospitals or any of this other stuff. What it means is we'll have access to better resources that will replace those, and we'll get to decide. We'll get to go to better hospitals, because the bad hospitals nobody wants to go to. They're not getting money, they get shut down. So this is something that's really important to understand. The other thing the other question you brought up, I'm going to try to recall this. We were talking about the social contract and basically, these rights that you mentioned, UN law that was passed in the 40s that gave certain people certain rights, and we enjoy those rights now, and that's part of our contract. We need to understand what rights are, and the word right actually comes from right, like it's the opposite of wrong, right? Do I have a right to steal from somebody? No, because stealing is wrong, right? So stealing is wrong, therefore it's not a right. Do I have a right to exist? Well, it's not wrong to exist, so clearly I have a right to exist. Do I have a right to breathe? Well, breathing is not wrong, so I have a right to that. And so we've had discussions, because there's definitely gray areas, right? Do I have a right to take this land? And well, somebody else says, no, but I have a right because I already took that land. That's already mine. But you weren't here when I took it. And you get into these kind of disputes over what these rights are. And that's kind of why, government came along and started saying, okay, we're going to be the ones to decide what these rights are. But rights are not given by government. If anything, they're decided by the community, and the community sometimes lets the government decide that for them, because the community is just, we don't want to get involved. We elected people. We'll let them handle that for us. But ultimately, governments, we have to recognize that governments do not grant rights. So even in the United States Constitution, where it says, people have these rights, or in the UN, when they say these are human rights, they're not granting rights, they're recognizing rights. And what the government usually intends to do by writing that these are rights, what they're generally intending to do is to say, we're creating this government, and because we recognize these rights, our government cannot infringe on those rights. So let me go back to, you talked about the people who signed this, and because it's the Constitution is kind of like a contract, right? A lot of people signed it, but they didn't sign it on my behalf, because I wasn't even born then, right? They signed it on behalf, in the instance of the United States, they signed it on behalf of the states. The laws that were passed in the UN, the people who signed those and voted on those were signed on behalf of the countries that they represented, the governments that they represented. But those governments don't always represent the people. We have to understand this. We as individuals, we get to make our own decisions. And even though there are governments, and even though we're tricked into voting in their elections and all these other things, and they convince us that they represent us, they don't represent us. We have to understand that. And sometimes when they do represent our best interests, like even if they, because once in a while governments do things that are good for us, even though it might not be good for somebody else, we can look at it and say it was a good thing. We have to recognize they didn't do that for us, right? They didn't do that because of us. Unless you have some sort of direct democracy, which has plenty of problems in itself, we weren't sitting there saying, yes, go to your national government and assign somebody to go to the UN and have them sign that document for me. We didn't get to make that decision. All these decisions were made for us. And we really have to recognize that. And so when a government says we have these rights, we don't have those rights because the government says we have those rights. The government is acknowledging the rights.
Interesting. I agree with you when you say human rights and all rights are not given by the state. That is the real fact, but because human rights are inherent, are inborn. That's really a crucial point when you say it's not supposed to be given to you by the state. But now, let's look at the point of, having an alternative to taxation. Because when you look at governmentalists, they will tell you that one government will provide the social order that make you to thrive in an environment. They will bring you all these services, the education, the roads, the health sector. Now, when you see taxation is theft, maybe we would say that some actions of taxation are not good, and they make taxation to be called theft. But when we term the whole thing and say taxation is theft, we give ourselves a responsibility of, trying to get everything in order that has been done by the taxes. What do you think is an alternative?
That's where we as a community have to figure that out, because I can say, okay, over here where I live, the government provides this one service, and I can come up with a way that's 10 times better to provide that service at a fraction of the cost. But where you live, it might not work because we have different resources available. Whether it's the land that we live on, do you live near an ocean? Do you live near a desert? What resources do you have at your disposal to do certain things? And this kind of goes back to the point that I made, where the government tries to make a one-size-fits-all program for everybody, when not everybody works the same. Not everybody, not everything works the same for everybody. Education is an interesting one, where in the U.S. a lot of people, they always say, oh, without government we wouldn't be able to educate our kids. But what the government has done here is they've created a national federal program that determines what every student in the entire country is going to learn. And what that means is, and how they're going to learn. And what that means is you have different people who learn in different ways. Some people are visual learners. Some people are experienced learners. Some people can't sit still in a classroom for hours and hours and hours. Some people want to be out and learning. Some people, their future is they like nature. They like plants and animals, and they want to get into a future that's, that involves farming or something relating to nature. Other people want to get into science and technology. Other people can, everybody's different. But what government has done is they've tried to say, this is good for everybody. And it's the exact same thing with economic development, right? What is the best way to build a city? Well, that depends on what the city looks like. So if you have a worldwide government or even a federal government that says, I oversee hundreds of cities, we're going to make laws that govern how these cities are created. It doesn't work because each city is different. And so when you look in each community inside of each city, the same thing applies. So, we have different wants and needs. Some people live out in rural areas where their houses are miles and miles apart. Do they want to spend all their money fixing every little pothole, or are they happy to drive on dirt roads? Versus people who live in a big city and they're all packed together and they say, no, we need smooth roads because we use them a lot. We need to make sure we have parking spaces and all this other stuff. It's completely different. We also hear, law enforcement. People in big cities usually want more. They want more police, because if somebody breaks into their house, they want somebody who's going to come and help them defend themselves. If you live out in the country, if you live out on a farm, you don't have that, because what are they going to do if your next door neighbor is 2 miles away? What are they going to do? Put a police officer at everybody's house so that you have one close by? It's completely unrealistic. And what government fails to address is that everybody's needs are different, and the solutions to all of our problems are always going to be different. So instead of asking for the government to do certain things, what we need to do is we need to get back to coming together as communities and figuring our problems out. And some of that is already done for us in the form of the free market. When you have people who are, they say, hey, I have an idea that's going to create a solution to this. And I know, like, everybody thinks this idea is crazy. Nobody believes me. Nobody thinks it's going to work. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to convince just a few people to give me some money to create this. And then I'm going to sell it to everybody else individually, and they can just pay to use it. They don't have to put all this faith in ahead of time and donate all their money to make a program that they think is going to fail. And this is where we have free market solutions. And of course, this is where the government usually comes in and says, no, you're not allowed to do that. So that's it's really, I can't recommend solutions. The only thing I can really recommend is that we need to figure out our solutions. And there's millions of things, there's millions of problems to solve. And no one person can do that, especially not a government.
Thank you. Interesting. Now, still on the same point, when you say we have to come out as, we come back on a drawing board as a community, well, a community as well will need the leadership. And when we make up a leadership team, we shall again have the government, which government shall have to get the taxes to support it. So
well, we don't.
We shall come back to that. Now, let me welcome everyone who has joined us. Welcome to liberteach Africa series, the program by African Justice Media. Those who are following us on Facebook, just keep on sharing, comment, have your comments. We are going to ask our guests to the questions. If you really have questions, just make sure that you raise up your hand, or you can type your message in the chat box there, and we shall be able. We are still with Dan Behrman. He is a former candidate aspirant on the Libertarian Party in the United States, and now he is standing in for governor of Texas. Man is known so much in his libertarian activism and with the phrase taxation is theft, which is actually coming as a policy, that the way taxes are taken from the people is through the use of force. Let me hope we are learning something from what he is saying. When taxes are taken from you through involuntarily, that we need to do things with voluntary cooperation. That's what he believes. Now, if you have questions, just raise question and we ask him. Now, going back to you, Behrman, Daniel. Now, sometimes we pay to private members of society and private companies. But why is it hard for us to believe that government can do so? But when a private company decides, let me take an example that you are not supposed to enter this building unless maybe you wash your hands and you give us $1,000 US. A private individual would be happy to pay that. But when government says to do business here, you are going to pay us a certain amount that we will take as taxes, we would not accept. Is it because, what could be wrong with that? What is your analysis? Do we trust more the private sector than the public sector? And also, how would we make sure that we have the public good? We have services running, we maintain that public good, because sometimes they say private people actually do not consider the responsibility of the community as their responsibilities. Actually, this is what is said by most humanitarians. They think we have, as humans, we have a responsibility of fellow human beings. Thank you.
Right. I think there's a couple interesting points there. So I want to talk about electricity because I've lived in places where electricity was provided by private companies, and I've lived in, there's still always some sort of government involvement, but I've also lived in places where the government is mostly involved in providing electricity. And what I've seen is that when it comes to the government, when there's a power outage, when there's a failure of equipment, when something goes wrong, it takes the government a lot longer to restore electricity when it goes out. And the reason for that is the government is not concerned with making money. The government is, oh, well, we've got all these programs going on. We're doing all these things. Let's figure out our priorities and let's figure out where we get the electricity fixed. When you have a private company delivering electricity, which by the way, electricity was invented by basically private companies. What you have is those companies say, hey, for every second that these people are not receiving electricity, we're losing money. So they will make sure that the electricity is turned back on almost immediately. And I've lived, like I said, I've lived in areas where electricity was provided by private companies, and whenever the power goes out, it comes back on quick. When I've lived in places where the government provided electricity, it's taken a very long time, sometimes days or even weeks, for the electricity to come back. And that's on top of, even fixing other problems, just electrical problems that only have to do with, one specific location where you have to deal with their customer service and try to get somebody out to actually fix something. When it comes to a private company, they're there because they need the money. When it comes to the government, this isn't their main source of income. They still have all their taxes. So, what do we care if we're making, an extra few cents every hour from this particular house? So I think that's really important. The other thing is, you mentioned about, I think what you were trying to get to about, if you had a business that had water and you were going to go in there and wash your hands, is like a sales tax where the government would say, you're doing business. And so I want a piece of that. Basically that's, if you and I have an agreement, we have an agreement. There's no coercion. There's no force. We're not forced. I don't have a gun pointed at you. You don't have one pointed at me. We just say, I agree to buy this from you at this price, and that's it. Now, when the government comes along, they say, well, when you buy from him, give me an extra $1. Why would I give you an extra $1? How are you making this transaction any better? Now, they might say, if you give me an extra $1, I'll make sure that the water he gives you is clean. And I might say, okay, that's fine. I'll pay the extra $1. But I might also say, no, you know what? I trust him. I don't need to pay you $1. I trust him. I know that the water's clean. And that's my decision. But if the government were sitting there saying, you don't have any choice in the matter, you have to pay me $1 so that I can tell you, even though you trust him, so that I can tell you this water is clean. And especially even though I'm washing my hands in it, I'm not drinking it. It does, like, the quality doesn't even have to be that great, right? Just as long as it's clean enough to make my hands cleaner, right? So that's for me to decide, but the government is taking away that right to decide. So that money is theft because now there is coercion involved. There's force. There's, well, what if I don't pay you? Are you gonna pull your gun out and take it from me forcibly? And if I don't have the money, are you going to take me to jail until, I can call a friend and make them pay you for me? What's the actual consequence of this? Now, something else that's really important is if this business of providing the water were provided by the government, there's only one government. So we only have one option. And if they're doing a terrible job, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? We're not going to go anywhere, right? We can't, because we're not allowed to, because the government is the only one who's allowed to do this. Remember, this is the government, not when the government says we're going to do this, the government says nobody else is allowed to do it. Because if the government were doing it and you were doing it, then I'd have choices, right? And if I went to the government and if I paid them for it, I really wouldn't have a problem with it, right? Because it's voluntary, it's consensual. But if they're telling you you can't do it anymore because they're doing it, well, then they're stealing from you and they're stealing choices from me, right? But also, if the government weren't involved at all, as soon as somebody sees, hey, this guy made a business, he's making money because he's providing water for people to wash their hands, somebody else is going to come along and say, well, I'm going to do the same thing. I want to make some money. And so now there might be two places where I could go wash my hands. And then if you decide, I've made enough money and I'm not going to care too much about the business and the quality of the water goes down, or, or the quality of the service goes down, whatever the case may be, I can say, hey, you know what? I don't like this place anymore. I'm going to go to another place. And we have, again, choices and choices and choices. But as soon as the government comes in and says, no, we're going to do this, the first thing they do is they say nobody else is allowed to do it. And they take away our choices, which takes away our quality, our decisions. It takes away so much.
Right. That takes us to the point of an individual deciding, like everyone making his own rules, so that we do not have a kind of collective action by maybe a group of people, which is government. Now, how feasible is that? How feasible is it for every individual to have their own rules, to have their own way of governing themselves? How feasible is that? Because we understand the fact that diversity is a human element, is a human character. And we are born from different areas. We have different social elements that differentiate us, the age, the race, the tribes, where we come from. How would we have a kind of social harmony or social order when everyone is making his own rules to follow?
Well, it's not necessarily about making our own rules. It's about making our own decisions. There are still basic rules, right? You don't kill people, you don't steal from people, you don't lie to people. These are really all basic rules. When it comes to things like property rights we talked about earlier, and there's gray area where somebody says, no, that's mine, and somebody else says, no, I saw it first. You get into these disputes of who actually owns something, and this can always be decided by a community. It's unfortunate, but when these disputes are going to happen, and what's interesting is, like, people think that by the government disputes from happening, but even with all these laws, you have these disputes, and people take these cases, they take their disputes to court to have the government decide for them. At the end of the day, it's somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. The winner is going to feel like they were right. The loser is going to feel like they were robbed. They still feel like they were right. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put off the whole thing. They wouldn't have played as far as they played. Someone's always going to feel like they lost. Now, whether that decision came from a handful of people who are off in some Congress somewhere deciding, how they should pass laws, or whether that decision came from a community who knows all these people, who can sit in front of these people and say, like, no, around here, that's not how we do things. It doesn't matter. You're still going to have one person who wins and one person who loses, someone who thinks they were right and someone who thinks that they were cheated. You're not getting rid of that problem by creating government and having them make these decisions. So I think it's really important to kind of recognize what is there because of government and what is only there because of government, and what government has taken the exclusive right to have. Like right now we have courts. All the courts are government courts. That doesn't mean you can't have non-government courts. And actually they have some non-government courts. They're usually in the US, they have them just, basically to keep people out of the government courts. And so usually what they do is they say, go to a non-government court and see if you can work it out there. And if you still can't, then come to the government court. So what does that really mean? What that means is the government set up this court system to resolve disputes, and they still have no ability to resolve all of the disputes that this country has. So they're basically failing, and they're saying, okay, you know what? We're doing such a bad job at this. Let's get some private businesses involved in resolving some disputes so that we can move on with what we're doing. So it's an interesting question, and there's definitely a lot of it's gray area, right? There's not an exact answer for everything, and nobody knows what the future is going to look like. But we have to understand that what the government is doing is coercive, it's wrong, it's immoral, and we need to start looking for other solutions.
Thank you, Obama. Now, we have just 5 minutes of being notified by our timekeeper here. We have 5 minutes to end this discussion. It was 1 hour discussion, but the question is about is taxation theft cannot end, and you can even take the whole day to discuss this. But let me ask the last question. But if there is an individual there, any participant who has a question, please do raise up your hand and let us ask Behrman. He's a very resourceful man in that field of government policy, taxation. But now, Behrman, how when you say like that, all the points that you're marching around, does it mean we should abolish taxation? And how would the world be without taxation? Just imagine that. To just try to be a little bit so brief.
Yeah, I think we can get rid of it. We absolutely can. Taxes they haven't been around forever. They were invented at some point by somebody who said, I'm going to solve our problems. Just give me money. And, it wasn't always like this, and it doesn't need to be like this. So I absolutely think we can get rid of it. It's not something we can just snap our fingers, because a lot of people depend on government services. They don't have any way to feed themselves or to shelter themselves without government paying for it with taxes. And yeah, if you just got rid of it, that would be a disaster for a lot of people. But we have to at least understand that it is theft, and we have to start moving in a direction that has less coercion in government, less theft, and more freedom for the people.
Thank you. We have a question from Lutankome Imlan, and he says, I think you can see the chat box. What is your take on immunization programs maybe that are forced through laws like compulsory immunization before accessing some services? Just like this seems to be the case of COVID-19. You have to be vaccinated before accessing, which is by force, not voluntary cooperation that you're talking about as a principle. What is your analysis? So,
of course, I would say that this needs to be left up to the individuals. Now, you could have businesses who say, I want to protect my customers, and so therefore I'm not going to employ people who don't have a vaccine. I'm not going to allow unvaccinated people into my business. That would be totally fine. But when government comes in and says, we're going to mandate that you are not allowed to open your business. Because imagine you have a bunch of unvaccinated people, and they say, hey, we're going to go hang out at the unvaccinated restaurant where they don't care. And I don't care because I didn't get the vaccine. I'm going to go to this restaurant. Who has a problem with it? What person in that restaurant has a problem with that? They know by taking that job that they're not enforcing it. They know that the customers are coming in who might not be vaccinated. Everybody is there willfully deciding, hey, this is something I'm okay with. And the government is taking that right away from us. And I know this is a very emotional subject, and it's very difficult to kind of have this conversation, because there are so many different aspects to look at on this. But what we also have to understand is that there are corporations who are making money off of this whole vaccination process. And so is there a corporate motive to that? Is it true that the vaccine works? Is it true that you're better off with the vaccine? We also have research going on. Well, if you've already had COVID, you actually would be able to resist it better than somebody who has a vaccine, but that's not being taken into consideration. And so, I know it's kind of a completely different question, but my point to bringing this up is that this is an extremely emotional topic. And when I know people have these conversations, usually the reason they bring them up or they even ask these questions is because they have a fear. They're afraid of the virus, and they think the only solution is everybody in the world gets vaccinated And until then, everybody has to stay in their home. Some people are like that. Other people think the virus doesn't even exist. These are completely polar, emotionally charged positions. And when these two types of people get together, they just want to fight. And the reality is, there is some of this that is true. There are corporations who are trying to make money. There is question as to how dangerous the virus is. Is it dangerous for more people or for other people? And then there's a completely different question of assuming the worst or assuming the best. What power, what authority does the government have over any of this? Because if we decide, if we understand that we are rights and we are humans, we have rights, we're all created equal, then we should have a policy in place what the government can and can't do that would take effect regardless of whether this virus is the worst or whether it's the best.
Okay, thank you for that. Now I'll take a hand from Alan Setam. You raised your hand when time ago. Yes, you can unmute and ask your question, sir.
Thank you so very much, Justice, and thank you so much, Behrman, and everyone on the call. Well, my question is one that emanates from the kind of society that we live in. I mean, more so from the African continent, and to most of the spaces we work in. As young people, we find ourselves in spaces where there are high regimes of taxes that are, imposed on us. I would want to pick Daniel's mind in regards to what are some of the strategies as young people that we can, hold our different stakeholders accountable about the unscrupulousness and unrealistic taxes that they put even on the young people, even on the people that are just starting up fresh startups. What you can put across that we need now to put our best feet to in order to have this not killing our societies and killing the efforts that we have in putting up our best efforts in growing our country and growing ourselves. Thank you so much.
Right. I think you cut out a little bit during some of that, but I think the most of what I understood is what can we do to start advancing society away from taxation? Is that about right?
Yeah. As young people, you say as young people, what are the strategies?
Right. So the first thing is definitely education. It's becoming aware that we are not government property. You are not government property. Ultimately, you are an individual. You get to make your decisions for yourself. And understanding that when the government comes to you and says you have to do this, they're using force. They're threatening you. They're not asking nicely, please, will you do this? Just ask yourself, whenever the government asks you to do something, ask or else what? What are they going to do if you don't do it? And if the answer is that they're going to throw you in jail, or they're going to put a gun at you, then you have to understand that what they're doing is wrong. And once you come to this realization, anytime the government wants to do something, or anytime a problem presents itself in society, you'll be able to start looking for solutions. And once you understand that it's wrong to force people in that way, to say, well, if you don't want to go along with this solution, we're going to throw you in jail. Once you understand that, you'll be able to come up with better solutions. So I don't know what that may be. I can give you a few examples. Here is I've been bringing in medication from Mexico to the United States because the government has rules in place that make it extremely expensive in the United States. I'm able to go to Mexico, get it for a lot less, and bring it in. I'm breaking a few laws to do it, but it's a risk that I do because this is government approved medication that they're basically saying you're going to pay a lot more for it. And so finding these things, the risk isn't really that high. The government's not likely to come after me, because it's not like I'm bringing in drugs that they, say are going to be bad for people. These are drugs that the government already says is good for people and they need it to save their lives. So you can look for little things like this to do if you want to take those risks. If you don't want to take those risks, there are other things you can do, like starting businesses that provide alternative services from government services. creating ideas. I mean, Bitcoin is one that's turned into a whole thing of cryptocurrencies and blockchains. Somebody came up with an idea. Let's reinvent money. How do you take care of your community? Is there something in your community that the government is responsible for and they're not taking responsibility for it? Find a way to repair it and go around through your community and say, hey, we want to repair this. Will you donate money to it? And figure out ways to make that happen. There's really so many different things that you can do. You really just need to kind of look at your environment and figure out, you have to be a problem solver, figure out which problems you can solve and how you can solve them without having to steal from people or creating a government program to force people to pay for it.
Thank you, Behrman. Now, our time is already done. I'm sorry for those who are still raising up, but let me take just 2 questions. And Behrman, you forgive me for the wrong time management, but let's just take 2 questions because these questions cannot end. I'll take a question from John Socrates. What is a good or efficient taxation according to you? Now, the second question, Kerea, be brief and ask your question. Dan, I hope you're noting that. What is a good or efficient taxation according to you? Not that. Then let's take Kerea at once and you answer them at once. Yes, Kerea, unmute and ask your question. Okay, if she's not there, just answer that and we end the meeting.
Sure. So the most efficient taxation is no taxation. The whole point of taxation is that it's coercive and it's inefficient because of that. If somebody's giving you money,
Thank you so much, John.
Okay, we cannot hear you. Can you type? Can you try to?
Yeah, it sounds like a slow connection. Yeah, that's really kind of the whole thing, and this is government's whole attitude. Sometimes you get some politician who comes in and says he's really energetic and says we're going to solve this problem, we're going to make it happen. And he creates a government program, then he hires people, and okay, my job's done. I created the program. There's no incentive for people. There's no profit motive. There's no, people getting fired because they're not being nice to the customers. Usually you see really bad customer service from the government because they can treat you like crap and there's absolutely no consequences for it. But when people are in this to benefit themselves mutually, so they're benefiting you by providing you a service and you're benefiting them by providing them with some sort of profit, that's where everybody wants to do business. They want to create more. They want to advance society. And that really is, free markets really are the most efficient way to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Behrman, and thank you for really accepting to join us tonight. It's a pleasure, and from the Libertarian team from Uganda, and very many people here have listened to your ideas, and I really like the fact that you have joined us. Thank you for honoring our invitation, and we hope to keep on engaging you in our further episodes. We are happy to have future you on the African Justice Media liberteach Africa series, a program that is actually measured on the principles of freedom, liberty, human rights, using the media tools to advocate for freedom, liberty, human rights, and make people understand these ideas. So thank you so much. Maybe to conclude with, I would give you an opportunity to conclude with, what is your conclusion as we end this discussion?
We are not government property. Just